Welcome to our monthly forest health webinar, where we discuss some of the current issues going on around the region, because I know we have people viewing this from North Dakota as well as South Dakota and a couple of the other surrounding states. And today, what I really want to focus on our abiotic stress on trees, which means non-living, so we're not talking about an insect or disease, is changes in leaf color. And the reason for that is I'm getting a lot of them this year. And perhaps some of you master gardeners that go out and do diagnostics, as well as some of the arborists on this, probably are dealing with them as well. So I thought I'd focus on that. The webinars usually run, anywhere from 40 minutes to 60 minutes, depending on the content and the questions. And then at the end, I will be posting our ISA CEU credits. Now, by the way, those are only important if you're a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture. I'll mention it now, but I'll also mention it at the end. If you are a member, you need to write down the title, which I'll have exactly as written, as well as the CEU number. Apparently ISA, even if there's a couple of word changes, when you put the title, may say they won't accept it. So I'll remind you of that at the end as well. My name is John Ball, professor of forestry at South Dakota State University. I'm also the extension forestry specialist in South Dakota, and I'm doing these through my other appointment, and that is as the forest health specialist with the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. And Tony, who was up just at the beginning, usually adds a little bit more to this as well. He is the forest health administrator, so he's kind of the man behind the scenes in getting all that work done to make sure we get all reporting done to feds as well as other agencies. Let's see, make sure this isn't going to catch on me. There we go. I do want to mention this at the start. One picture of emerald ash borer. I know everybody's seen a lot of them. But the reason I'm showing you this is a picture I've just recently taken. And it shows you where the larvae are in their development right now. They're still incredibly small. I don't know if your screen will pick it up, but if you look at the very point of my knife blade there, the knife blade is actually touching an emerald ash borer larvae, and you can get an idea of the size. It's less than 1/4 of an inch right now. So they're all in what we call their first or second instar. Instars is molts. They molt 4 times as larvae. In other words, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in abrupt changes rather than the gradual changes we expect with people. We don't molt. But if we did, one day you'd be an infant, the next day you'd be a toddler, the next day you'd be a teenager, the next day you'd be old like me, I guess. And it'd be rather abrupt. But the other thing to it too is I want you to look at the galleries, and they're very dark there, and they're twisting back and forth. What that tells you, it's a very healthy tree. The more they curve back and forth, the healthier the tree, and they do that tight serpentine to keep from being suffocated by the sap in the tree. As the tree begins to decline, the galleries are not quite as serpentine. They're almost run in lines because they don't have to worry about the sap flow. So look at this picture, tells you 2 things. They're still very small, and this one attacked a very healthy tree. Now, most likely it will succeed because emerald ash borer is very effective at killing our native ash. But nevertheless, the tree health does play some role in thawing the attack, and it might be able to do so in this case. The other thing I want to point out is these galleries are so tiny right now, they're really not harming the tree. Think of them as tickling the tree just a bit. They're so tiny and the galleries are so small that they're not disrupting a lot of the phloem tissue, what moves food from the leaves down to the roots, nor are they interrupting the water flow from the roots to the top of the tree. Within the next month or so, that little insect will be about 1.25 inches. That's big. And 1.25 inches, it's plowing through the tree. And so it's disrupting the entire phloem tissue. And it's actually disrupting quite a bit of the sapwood, what moves water through the tree. And so I expect to see trees that are attacked by emerald ash borer beginning to discolor and wilt probably in about 30 days from now. Now, if you have an ash tree and you live in Union, Minnehaha, or Lincoln County in South Dakota, you may want to consider treating it if it's not being treated already. And while I would prefer you have treated it about a month ago, it's still okay to treat now, particularly if you got a little moisture in the soil. And for our neighbors over in Lyons County, Minnesota, which we just confirmed emerald ash borer by the profession has, their Minnesota Department of Ag did, confirmed it in Marshall, Minnesota, and it appears to have been there for several years already. So I know folks that hadn't been treating are suddenly getting on the gun and treating it. And of course, it was found in Moorhead earlier this year, and it was also found in Sioux City. So for all the South Dakotans here, it's essentially lining up along our eastern border all the way up and down the state. And I anticipate seeing more movement into the state within the next year or two, as we kind of predicted earlier on. Well, enough with the emerald ash borer for right now. We can discuss that at length at a later webinar. But this is the question I always get. You know, what's wrong with my tree? What's wrong with the leaves on my tree? Everybody notices leaves. They go out there and say, oh, I got holes in the leaves. Or their color isn't correct, or they're wilting. And they usually describe them very well. Well, you know, the leaves are curled or twisted, or they're red, and shouldn't they be green, or a number of other things. So people notice these things. Now, when they notice these things, in this case, these little punch holes in the leaves, their next thing is to assume everything is a bug or a fungus. Now, in this case, that is the elm flea weevil, and that's the little adult there that makes those little hole punches in the leaves. But we have a lot of problems where there isn't an insect or a pathogen. And those, of course, are abiotic problems, or non-living problems that we're going to focus on today. Well, the problem with the non-living is the next question everybody asks is there must be something we can spray. And unfortunately, for a lot of our abiotic problems, there are no treatments, at least no chemical treatments. Nothing's required to go out and spray your tree. And they're very disappointed in that usually. What they would like, and I understand that, is they want you to come out, you find something wrong with the leaves, you identify it within seconds. And even better, they can run down to the local garden center or hardware and buy a chemical and apply it the next day. And if all your discussions with homeowners led that way, most people would be thrilled with you because you got something identified and you gave them something to do. Unfortunately, those are rare. And with abiotic, they are very, very rare. So today we're going to focus on leaf problems, and specifically leaf color. I mean, what's the first thing you notice? Bright green leaves on a leaf. I think everybody would look at this picture, except for the chewed one on the left side. You'd probably say this is a pretty healthy tree. Look at those leaves, nice, deep, glossy green. Well, what if they look like this? What if you went out and you looked at your ash tree, and this is an ash tree, and you say, oh my goodness, look at all that discoloration. All right, what must be the problem? Well, the important thing to remember here is we still have to go through a process of determining what might be the causal agents. And there we need to separate symptoms and signs. And for all you folks that do diagnostics, this is kind of the basics. First of all, what's abnormal about the tree? Well, in the picture I just showed you, well, the leaf margins were white. Looks some discoloration. That would be a symptom. Symptoms are changes in the normal growth or appearance of the tree. If you look at the picture to your right, that is of an apple tree, and you notice those newer leaves don't look normal. They don't have a normal appearance. They're kind of a faded green, almost bleached, yet the veins are somewhat green. Well, all that does, all symptoms do is tell us how to describe it. What we really look for are signs, and that's physical evidence of the pest. And if you look at the picture to the left, what you're seeing there are those small structures, fruiting structures on the leaf. Now, if the reason for the discoloration of the leaf is due to an insect or a disease, we'll find signs eventually. We'll be able to find the causal agents that cause the problem. If the problem is abiotic, there are no causal agents. There are, by that I mean no living causal agents. There are no signs. So it gets a lot more difficult to diagnose discolorations. And remember, not every color difference is a problem. This tree I had read about for decades before I had an opportunity to see it. Michael Durr, in his classic manual of woody plants, 1976, described this beautiful golden red oak. Now, by the way, it's a North American tree. This is northern red oak, the same tree we plant in parts of South Dakota. And that only in this case, that's its normal color. This is a cultivar. So the abnormality on this plant is the feature that people pay extra for. So again, being able to identify the plant is kind of important in this case. And by the way, for everyone watching this says, I love this color and it's acquired taste, to be honest with you. But if you say, I love this color, I want to grow one, don't. This tree performs well in the kind of cloudy climate of England. If you plant it out in the Great Plains, where we have bright sunny days typically, except for the smoke from Canada this year, this bleaches out. So it doesn't work very well as an ornamental out where we're at. But what about this? Well, again, it's showing an abnormality, but the abnormality in this case, the mutation, is something we prize. This is the variegated Norway maple. And Norway maples have lots of different leaf colors. There's many, many, many different cultivars because it mutates so easily. Look at this one. This is the Princeton Gold maple. Again, another Norway maple cultivar that the leaves are kind of a yellow. In fact, in the spring, they can be a very bright yellow as they leaf out. And then with the summer heat and the bright sunshine, they tend to fade, maybe get a little bleached out with the season. So it doesn't look as nice as the ones out east do. But nevertheless, you'd say, well, what's wrong with my tree? And I get calls on this one, usually new homeowners. Well, I've got this tree in the backyard. There seems to be something wrong with it. Well, no, that's actually a Princeton Gold. And of course, you're all familiar with the kind of purpley leaves that we have out there. In this case, from the Crimson King maple, again, another Norway maple, which has this kind of a dark purple. And there's a good picture of all three of them at the library in Brookings, South Dakota. It's kind of neat to see all three, but we have our variegated on the side there, on the left side, the Princeton Gold in the center, which is beginning to fade a little bit. And then, of course, the Crimson King, which does surprisingly hold that deep purple color for the summer. So again, a lot of these abnormal color changes, while they're abnormal, they're actually the ornamental value for the plant, but not this. And this is what I want to start on today. I've probably seen more maples that look like this than any other year. And the calls keep just coming in about this discoloration, which is truly abnormal. As you might expect, nobody developed a cultivar that looks this bad. And people want to know what it is and what it's doing. Now, before I go into the what's, I want you to take a look a little closer at this picture, because it does show you something kind of interesting. If you look way down that stem, that shoot that's in the center, so you're kind of looking to the left. If you look at the left and you look kind of the leaves that are deeper into the plant, notice those are green. And then on the shoot itself, the leaves get a little paler. Notice that. They're kind of a pale green with bright green veins. And then you get up there, they're kind of bleached out, even the veins, and then you get to the very tip and they're even blackened, scorched. Those are very important symptoms because what this indicates to you is the reason for this appearance is due to an iron or manganese deficiency. In other words, the plant is not getting enough of either, or in some cases, as with maples, both of these microelements. And the reason why you can tell that is not only the symptoms, which I'll describe here in a moment, but the fact that the oldest foliage is green and the newest foliage looks the worst, almost a complete bleach. And the reason for that is iron and manganese are what we call immobile. Plant can't move them. In other words, they're absorbed in the leaf and they stay there. Nitrogen, for example, is mobile. A plant will rob nitrogen from the older foliage and move it to the newer foliage if it has to. In other words, if it's suffering from a nitrogen deficiency, the newest foliage will be green, the oldest foliage will be discolored. But on these, there's enough iron and manganese to get the tree going in the spring, but not enough to keep it going. And since it can't move it, the newest foliage will show these symptoms more and more and more till you get to the tips and it might be completely bleached or black with the scorching. So what we're looking at here is chlorosis, and it's a very bad year for it, and I'll explain why in a moment. But on a number of trees, the calls keep coming in. Why are the leaves on my tree yellow this year? And the term for that symptom is chlorosis, which is a general yellowing of the leaf. And this is a swamp white oak that certainly shows it. We also see a lot of what we call interveinal chlorosis. And this is where we have a yellowing of the leaf tissue between the veins while the veins remain green. And this is kind of the classic symptom of a micronutrient deficiency in the tree, that the newest foliage will be chlorotic, that it'll show interveinal chlorosis, that you'll see that the veins still are green or have a bright green border. Do you notice that on the midrib? The center of the midrib is discolored, but the sides are still green, so it almost looks like a parallel stripe running across the tree. This, even though it's a symptom, and symptoms only describe, it's a pretty good symptom to tell you exactly what the problem is. That the plant's not able to get up enough iron or manganese, or in some cases both. And by the way, the problem is so severe this year that it's fooling people. People are thinking, well, gee, what's wrong with my tree? It can't be iron or can't be manganese because the leaves are turning black. This has been a very bad year for chlorosis. So what it is the chlorosis is often associated with necrosis. Necrosis means death of tissue. Now, tissue can die for a number of reasons, but if it's associated with yellow leaves and you start getting more and more of these black dots in it, these irregular ones, and notice they're on the tip. I know you can't look further back into this plant very easily, but the leaves are a little darker, and the worst leaves, the leaves that are the most discolored and showing this black gray, are at the tips of the tree. And as I said, when we start seeing this, and it's very common on maples and oaks this year, you know the plant has a very severe case of chlorosis. And the problem relates to this. It's the pH chart. Now, you're all familiar with soil pH, and I come from an area of Ontario and Michigan, where our soils were acidic. We really didn't talk about problems of chlorosis, except in urban areas, because then all our building materials actually make the soil rather alkaline as well. But our native soils were acidic. We're out here, our native soils might be neutral at best. And the way we describe it too is neutral soils are between 6.6 and 7.3 on the scale. Between 7.3 and 7.8, they're described as slightly alkaline. And above 7.8, moderately alkaline, and above 8.4, they're just bad. Well, what's the pH do? It causes insoluble forms of these microelements, iron and manganese, to dominate. What I want you to notice on this chart here, if you read down the side, and if you look at where many of our soils are between 7.3 and 7.8, you'll notice nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Okay, the big ones, the macronutrients, the macro elements, as we call them. And of course, the big three are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but we also include calcium and magnesium. Notice those are not affected by pH until you really start getting up above 8 in the case of nitrogen and phosphorus. But in our soils, we don't run into any problems with the plant being able to take up whatever nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium there is. Now, the soils can be deficient in nitrogen, but you can add it and the plant will be able to absorb it. But if we go down to iron and manganese, look at that. Now you'll notice they start dropping even at about 6, 6, 6, 7. And so the ideal soils for many trees are around 6.5. But nevertheless, there's enough in the soil that usually we don't see a lot of chlorosis on those trees from the lack of these elements until we get to about 7.3. And notice at 7.3, it's a fine line. It's getting very little. And these are critical building blocks for photosynthesis. And what happens is we're losing chlorophyll, and because they're not able to take up enough iron and manganese, and the plants become off colored. And that, now I will mention, if you look down further, zinc and copper can also be an issue. The importance there is the reason they're called micronutrients or microelements, and that would include iron, manganese, boron, zinc, and copper, as well as a couple of others, is the plants don't need very much of them. And zinc and copper are not keys to photosynthesis. Every now and then we get someone who says, well, I'm going to add zinc to my trees. And if you add it to your trees, don't be surprised if you kill them. They don't need a lot of zinc. Our soils have an abundance of zinc. Thank goodness not all of it's available. But for iron and manganese, yes, they do need more than they're able to absorb. And the issue is it's not that we don't have sufficient iron and manganese in the soils. Do you realize the fourth most dominant element in the soil is iron? It's just the fact that with our elevated pH, they're in an insoluble form. And the only way you're going to get inside the tree is if you move with water into the tree. Okay, think of it as swallowing a pill. All right, you swallow a pill with some water, dissolves in your tummy, and it is absorbed. Bad analogy for trees. They don't have tummies. But nevertheless, the only way you're going to get inside the tree is you better come in a soluble form, dissolved. And unfortunately, at the high pHs, it's no longer in a soluble form. And it doesn't affect all trees. Here we are looking at 2 oaks. One actually in North Dakota here, that's the bur oak, and the eastern pin oak is interesting enough in South Dakota. By interesting enough, eastern pin oak is not very common out here. It's very common out east. And the eastern pin oak is showing the classic shape and unfortunately the classic color. In the spring, this tree in Sioux Falls is bright green. And then it goes yellow very quickly as new leaves form. And by fall, it's almost a bleached out tree. Well, they're both oaks. Okay, why is one green and one yellow? And you'll never see chlorosis on a bur oak. They can handle our pH. You'll almost always see chlorosis on an eastern pin oak because they can't. So only certain tree species are affected by alkaline soils. In other words, their inability to take up iron or manganese. And if you want to know why, it has a lot to do with the roots. That trees have worked out a system to extract iron and manganese and the other elements from the soil. And trees produce these root exudates, primarily phenols, and they'll excrete those. And what they do is they help iron chelation, which is bonding it to a metal ion so it can be absorbed. It doesn't precipitate out, so it's soluble. And they work as a carbon source for microbe growth. Now, here's the interesting thing. Tree roots can acidify the soil in the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is almost a fingernail thickness around the roots and the mycorrhizal fungi. Think of that. So in other words, your tree might be on a pH of 7-8, but right there, a fingernail thick area around the roots, it's actually 6-9. And all the iron it wants and all the manganese it wants is available to it. Unfortunately, not all trees can pull this trick off. Some trees are not dependent on acidifying the mycorrhizae. They're depending on the soils containing adequate amounts of iron and manganese without having to acidify, because the soils are naturally acidic. But what does this also tell you? Soil health is important. If you're going to try to grow an eastern pin oak in South Dakota, one that is very susceptible to chlorosis, is you want to make sure it's on the best soil possible and you take care of the soil. And a healthy soil is a living soil. It has to have all the microbes in it that are necessary for growth. Why? Because it's got to acidify that rhizosphere. It's got to get that thing going. So again, soil health is important. And as I mentioned earlier, I see more of it this year than any other year. And paradoxically, it's due to two problems: too much water and too little. If you're West River, west of the Missouri, for those that aren't familiar with that term, it's been raining a lot. Every week I'm out in the hills and every week it's rained on me. And so the soils are actually saturated in some cases and they're too moist. And what that means is we're not maintaining the right microbes and the trees are not able to take up the iron and manganese. So we're seeing that. The other is it's too dry when we get to the eastern part of our state. And because of that, we're not getting the microbes. So I'm seeing chlorosis showing up in the east and showing up in the west, far more common than I usually do, both for the same reason, soil health, but caused by different problems. Too dry at one end, too wet at the other. Now, again, importance for everybody here is take care of your soil. It's really important. Add organic material back into the soil. Provide that carbon source for microbial growth. In fact, I've seen some very interesting studies where merely adding carbon back into the soil has eliminated chlorosis. Why? You're building a healthy soil with the microbes that can acidify the rhizosphere for the tree. So I'll talk about other solutions, but the biggest one is make sure you maintain a healthy soil. And when you got a choice, make sure you have the right roots. This is a nursery in New Mexico, a picture I took last spring, I think it was. And I was talking to the manager there, and him and I were discussing a very common problem with nurseries, and that is the changing of the rootstock. In other words, the top of the tree, that's a named cultivar, but the root system is often just a seedling. And they change them from time to time. So the nursery notices how trees perform differently depending on the rootstock used. Well, the point here is that I can show you swamp white oaks that are just brilliant color like this. And I can show you ones that are deep green. And the difference is the rootstock. English oak does not suffer chlorosis at all. And if you plant a swamp white oak on a on an English oak root system, it'll stay green. And if you plant a swamp white oak on a swamp white oak root system, it can turn very bright yellow. There's a beautiful tree in Pierce, South Dakota. It's growing in gravel in a parking lot island, about as alkaline a condition as you can get, one that is very, very, very deficient in carbon sources for microbial growth, but it's brilliant green. It's on an English oak root system. And so it's going to do that. Where if it had been on a swamp white oak root system, it'd be bright yellow. In fact, it'd probably be dead. It's such an alkaline site. So roots are important for this. And that's how you maintain the green ones. Well, what other trees? River birch. River birch suffers from chlorosis. And if you go down to Sioux Falls, one of our larger urban areas where the soil's been heavily disturbed, yes, you're going to see a lot of yellow ones, particularly this year again. And notice on this, with iron deficiencies, remember it's in mobile, so always look at the newest growth. That'll be what's discolored. That you'll find these contrasting narrow green veins. The leaves will become bleached and can occasionally become scorched, as I showed you with the oak. So if you're seeing a chlorotic river birch, the deficiency is iron, just iron. Manganese is also immobile, and the leaves become yellow with green bands. Notice it's a little bit more banding, and you'll also get more of these necrotic spots. If you're looking at a maple that's chlorotic, such as a silver maple, Freeman maple, or red maple, the problem is iron and manganese. So if the chlorosis is on an oak or river birch, the deficiency is iron. That's all you need to provide. If you're looking at a maple, the deficiency is going to be iron and manganese. And I've run into a number of tree companies that have merely added iron and not got a color change. And once they started adding manganese as well, then they get the tree coming back. Now, occasionally you get a maple that just needed a little extra iron or a little extra manganese, and just adding one could do it. But quite honestly, you're not going to know which one it really needs. And so you're probably adding both of these trees. And I'll touch upon that again here. So if it's a birch or an oak, you need to add iron. And I'm not endorsing this rainbow product, but I'm just using it as an illustration. There's a number of products out there, but the manufacturers will tell you that. River birch, any of your oaks, which would be your swamp white oaks, your northern red oaks, your eastern pin oaks, those that are susceptible to chlorosis. Again, bur oak is not, nor is English oak. Then you need to add iron. If it's a maple, as you're seeing here, which is river birch, you need to add manganese as well. And as well, they even say on their labels that deficiencies on maples often require both. And I remember back in '76, when my advisor wrote the first paper in Journal of Arboriculture pointing out that they had figured out that it was a manganese deficiency in maples. And that's, you had to add both in order to get them to be green. This is a good example. I had a number of trees that tree company was looking at treating, and they said, well, we're just going to add iron. And I said, let me do a tissue analysis. So I collected the chlorotic leaves, okay, mid-season. And what I found in the foliage was 122 parts per million of iron and 235 parts per million of manganese. Now, the interesting thing is there are guides that tell you what the healthy tissue should contain. For many of the trees we use in the landscape, right down to, in some cases, they know the differences among the cultivars. So we already have the information. Okay, this is what we found. What should we have in order for that tree to be green? But 160 parts per million iron and 525 manganese. Well, if you take a look at this, yeah, adding a little iron would help. But if you just add iron, you aren't changing this, are you? Because look at how deficient it is in the manganese. So once again, if it's a maple, you're probably going to be adding both, following label instructions. Don't add more than what they recommend. And you'll get the leaves that'll come back green. Now, depending on how the treatment is applied, If you inject it into the trunk of the tree at the base, quite often those maintain a tree green for 3 years. If you add it in the soil as a chelated form, chelated, so it is not going to become insoluble, quite often that can last for a couple of years. If you're just going to spray it on the leaves, that lasts for that season at best. So most people do one of two things: either have it injected at the base of their tree, or they add it as a chelated iron or manganese, or both, really as a fertilizer, late fall or early spring, and have that absorbed, and that'll last for a while as well. But the other thing I always recommend is try to take care of your soil as much as you can too. Make sure they're not too wet, not too dry. Add organic matter back into them. And organic mulch is an ideal way to help that tree improve its microbial environment so that it can actually acidify the roots, the area around the roots. Well, by the way, that's not the only color change. It's a big one, but I did want to point out some others. Midsummer, if you're noticing maple trees turning red a little early, a lot of times that's stem girdling roots, and I've been noticing those. And so, you know, we're getting some maples out there. They're getting these yellows and reds and all this, and it kind of looks nice. And I even looked at one where the person said, well, they called the tree company. They came out and said they'd fertilize it this fall. Well, tree doesn't need fertilizer. There's the problem. Very common with maples, by the way. Not a real issue with oaks. But if you see a maple in particular this summer that is turning color, and by turning color, more of reds than that chlorotic appearance, look at the base of that tree. And if on one side it's going flat, notice how it's going straight in the ground where I have the arrow. If you dig around, not very deep, but you dig around, you're going to expose a root that's circling around and girdling the tree. It's called stem girdling roots because it's girdling the stem, not a root. Usually you don't see this becoming a problem on a tree until it's been in the ground 5 to 10 years. I even had one where I went out to the person, I said, as stem girdling root, tree's going to die. They said, well, we planted it 15 years ago. Well, 15 years ago, they made a mistake. And the mistake is, well, they went from containers, killer containers. Now, I'm not saying don't plant container trees, though bare roots a good way to avoid this problem because we're planting a lot of containers now. But when you take it out of the pot and take it carefully out of the pot, you need to do a couple of things to make sure it's going on the ground properly. You know, you can pull out some of those roots if you can, but that's going to be kind of hard to do. But if you leave them that way, they're going to circle. And this is a picture that Aaron sent me, a city forester up in Aberdeen. Look at the root system of this tree. Now, I want you to notice two things. One, those roots are going around and around, right? And as they get bigger, they're going to girdle the stem. And how are they going to girdle the stem? Notice how high those roots are compared to the stem. It's been in the pot. The roots are actually right about the stem level. So we've got two issues here. Well, how do we correct that problem? We've known about stem girdling roots since about the mid-70s. Bob Tate did a study on them in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and came up with that's why the Norway maples were declining there. And early on, this is what they told us to do, is cut the roots, just slash them, quarter the ball, as they'd say. Not only does that wreck a very nice pruning saw, but it doesn't correct the problem. So splitting the ball or making these vertical slashes as seen here will not correct the problem. Okay, you still see it in some old extension bulletins or some magazines that aren't keeping up. Instead, what you want is go all the way around the ball. Now you pulled the whole soil ball out, and with the back of the spade or the shovel, go through and cut all the way around. And if you do that, as you can see here, which direction are all the roots pointed? They're pointed out. And everywhere you cut a root, it'll generate new roots near that tip. So you're going to thicken up the root system, and all the roots are going out rather than going around. It's an easy problem to correct. Even if you don't see a lot of circling roots yet, it's not going to hurt to do this. By the way, we see this as a real problem on ash, not that people are planting ash anymore. Maples, lindens, very common in lindens. We got 2 on campus I've been watching die for 15 years. One of them is just about completely dead, so I'll probably take it down, and now I'll have another example because it was too late to try to pull that root out. Again, problem easy to correct at planting, hard to correct afterwards, and will hasten the death of the tree. And I want to remind you something else. The only way you can have a stem girdling root is if you plant the stem in the ground, right? The stem's above ground, you're not going to have a root going around it in most cases. And that, so watch your planting depth too. It's a common recommendation that we have. Trees come too deep in containers. So make sure when you're doing these that you plant them at the right depth. You're going to have to remove the soil at the top of the pot first before you plant it. As you can see in this little insert here, that tape that I have around there was the depth of the soil in the pot. The top of the roots were that far down. So you're going to pull some soil away from the top in order to get the depth correctly, because planting too deep is really the #1 killer of trees. And it contributes to stem girdling root, because now the stem's in the ground, and if you have roots that are already starting to circle, now they're going to strangle that trunk. And as a reminder, dig the hole about 3 times wider as well when you're doing this. Just good practice. Well, what other colors are we seeing out there? Believe it or not, West River. If you haven't been West River, this is the year to go. You're going to carry a raincoat because it rains all the time. I've heard a lot of tourists complaining. We'll see what happens during rally week. And by the way, bring a lot of mosquito repellent. There are clouds of mosquitoes in spearfish this year. I'm just amazed how many mosquito bites they come back with. But some of the lower lying areas where water tends to pool, particularly in those gumbo soils, we're seeing silver maples already turning with their fall color. Why? Waterlogged soils, right? It's not chlorosis. They're drowning. And because of that, the chlorophyll's dying in the leaves, and the anthocyanins, the reds, are beginning to present. And so if you go out there now and you notice maples in particularly are turning red, that's not a good sign. Oh, and by the way, planting too deep, sometimes we do that afterwards. I just have to show you these pictures. Aaron had these, and this is a home up by Aberdeen, South Dakota. They built a brand new home on a hill. They made the hill, kept the trees, made the hill around them. And they were quite surprised the trees were getting to decline. Now, the interesting thing is, look at that kind of edging around the base of the tree. If you look down there, it's 14 feet. That's why their trees were dying. Yeah, they're turning color. Can't hold their breath that well. And just as another one, too deep, here was a tree that was backfilled 2 feet after construction about 25 years ago. I watched them do this at South Dakota State. And I said, "You're going to kill that tree." And I said, "No, we won't." It took 25 years, but they killed it. Look at that. You're actually looking at bark. And that bark was compressed so much by the surrounding soil, it almost was smooth. And it killed the tree, just backfilling 2 feet. Now, the other thing we saw, and we occasionally see this every year, is spring color. In the spring of the year, if we have a cold spring, maples, particularly maples, will come out red. Maples and cranberry bush viburnum are the two. And I had a lot of calls this spring. We kind of had a little bit of heat. Remember, it got up almost to 90, and then temperature dropped. And so everything kind of stalled. And when they stall, the chlorophyll doesn't really develop very well. And that red, the anthocyanins, will show through. And so we were getting all this very colorful leaf out. Now you'll notice the leaf, or if you notice it, the leaves kind of stopped too. They didn't keep opening. And people panicked over this. What do we do? And I say, well, turn up the thermostat, wait for the heat, which came. And once it came, leaves turned green, leaves continued to grow. And by the way, we have some trees that naturally have a little bit of color in the spring. In fact, Ammermackia, one of my favorite trees, has what I call a spring color. When they first come out, all those little fine hairs on the leaves give it a very silvery appearance. And by the way, I might add, this tree is in bloom right now on campus here at SDSU. That's the one right outside my office. And it's been beat up a little by crews, so the shape isn't the best. But nevertheless, full bloom. And if you're ever looking for a small tree, about a crabapple sized tree, that has late summer flowers or midsummer flowers, this would be my first choice. And the flowers, by the way, smell like fresh cut alfalfa. I kind of like that. Well, I looked at this one yesterday. Ooh, turning red. Poorly drained soils? Not in this case. In this case, it's herbicide. And so you can find some discoloration on trees related to herbicide. And so again, read and follow label directions is essential. You'll also get discoloration of leaves due to herbicide as well. Roundup, glyphosate will cause this. If you get a little drift, you'll get the spotting of the leaves and necrotic tips to it. It, some cases, can almost appear chlorotic, but it has to be a very alkaline soils before ash become chlorotic. And those little droplets and the fact it was next to a field in which they had applied glyphosate pretty much solved that issue as to what was the cause. Any of our contact herbicides, they don't move in the plant. Whatever spots you have on it will stay. But then we also have what's called flow mobile herbicides. These are moved up and down through the tree in the same tubes, if you will, that move the sugars. And then we have xylem mobile that move up the foliage. And atrazine is a good example of that. We use it a lot for corn. Picloram's a good example of the flow mobile in there. But if you look at these, look at that discoloration. Now, notice that's not fitting what chlorosis is, but we are still getting some veinal yellowing. And it starts at the tip and works its way in. And this is herbicide. So we can have a separate session just on herbicide injury, but just want to point out that we can get some of this discoloration. And by the way, for xylem mobile, the symptoms appear on the oldest foliage first, and the newest foliage will remain green. So looking at the pattern is kind of important. Flow mobile, it's usually going to show up on the new growth, not the old growth. So again, the pattern is kind of important. And this is picloram on a pine. And we're seeing still a lot of dicamba drift as well. Not a discoloration as much as a total distortion. With our growth regulators, such as dicamba, they are going to cause that twisting in that as well. So far more than just a color change, you'll notice that curling and twisting of the tips to it. Common ones, dicamba, picloram, and so on. The only way you know exactly what it is we have to do testing for that. And it's rather difficult and expensive to do. So we don't routinely do that for samples on it. And just a reminder, this gentleman actually applied the chemical around the base of his pine trees, thinking he was doing just fine with the herbicide. And it said, don't apply it within the root zone. Well, remember, the root zone is a distance equal to the height of the tree, not to the edge of the drip line. And people confuse it as he did, and he ended up essentially killing all the pines. And remember legumes on herbicides. Black locust, honey locust, coffee tree, redbud, and Siberian pea shrub are all legumes. And if you ever read a label that says don't use around legumes, it's more than just soybeans. We have trees that are affected as well. And then finally, We do have some herbicides that'll turn foliage white. So if you see something really abnormal, it might be herbicide. But once again, in order for us to figure out what herbicide it might be or what class, we would look at the distortion of the leaves. We'd look at the color of the leaves, and we'd look at whether the newer leaves are turning color or the older leaves are turning color. So patterns are important. With that, I'll finish up just a couple minutes early. I'll check and see what questions we have. I see we have a couple. Usually Tony mentions the questions, but I don't think he's going to be able to. So I want to thank everybody for participating on this one. By the way, if you do need ISA certified arborist credits, you'll self-report, but the title is Abiotic Stress on Trees. That should be 23-023. All right, and I see we have some things in the chat here, so let me check. Let me move up here. Do trees suffer from ozone? Yes, they do. Excellent question. The ozone problems, I see more West River than I do East River. Why? Because we have those coal burning plants out there. And as we were measuring ozone in the Black Hills, you could see if we had a wind out of the northwest, we'd actually have some ozone. Now, by the way, we can detect ozone. We did not see it causing woody plant damage. The discoloration on some of the pines out in the Black Hills, those along roadways, was actually de-icing salts, but we could detect it. And let's see, the next question, does white birch suffer the same chlorosis? No, it does not. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Paper birch does not suffer chlorosis. River birch absolutely does. We see it all the time. Gray birch, which is commonly sold as a white spire birch, we'll see that as well. But this is one reason I like paper birch. And if someone said, what birch should I plant? It would be a paper birch. And Renaissance Reflection is one of my favorite because it's very much heat tolerant. We planted them on campus here 20 years ago. Trees look perfect. They're not being attacked by the boar yet because they're not that stressed, and they look great. And let's see. Suggest treatments, names of products for the maples. There's a number. If someone says, I want to do this myself, you can get Medicaps, MEDCAP, but buy the manganese Medicaps. Those are sold fairly commonly around garden centers and that. And some of the better garden centers, by that I mean ones that really cater gardeners, you can buy chelated, CHELATED, chelated manganese and iron to apply as a soil fertilizer. So those read and follow label directions, and you can pour it around the base, usually with a spreader. Just as you would any other fertilizer, and that'll be taken up. Now that, by the way, that's slower, and you'd want to do that in the fall or next spring. The injections, again, read and follow label directions and make sure you're doing them properly, but those will green up a tree fairly quickly. So you can do them in the spring and it'll green up. At this point in time, there's not much you can do this late season. So I'm really giving you what you can do for next year's crop of leaves. But as I mentioned before, maintaining tree health is very important. Have you been seeing anthracnose in maples this year? Yes. I've seen it in maples and I've seen it in ash. Again, more West River than East River. You get down to Yankton, no, it's been too hot and dry. Anthracnose really didn't develop, but I do see some in Brookings, and I see a lot of it out in Rapid City and Spearfish because it's just been relatively cool and wet. Is it okay to spray Roundup on the ground inside the root zone? I'll give you a qualified yes. And here's why it's qualified. I was at the National Arboretum 20 years ago, and they were noticing their crab apples were having tip dieback. And you know what it was the use of glyphosate around the base of the trees. They were mulched, and in mulch, those roots were actually coming up into the mulch itself, and they were spraying 4 to 6 times a season, and they were actually damaging enough roots that over time they started getting some dieback. But under normal circumstances, you're okay. However, you use the term, is it okay to spray Roundup? Remember, Roundup is a brand name, not a chemical name. It would be okay to spray glyphosate. Make sure that if you're buying Roundup as a brand name, that it only contains glyphosate, that it does not contain dicamba, for example. Dicamba you don't use in the root zone at all because it's not a contact herbicide. It'll be absorbed into the soil and taken up by the roots and will cause problems. And let's see, I think we had all the questions. We're at time here now, I believe. Yep, we're coming right up to 2 o'clock hour here, 1 o'clock for some of you East River folks. If your vacation is next week, West River, cancel it. Why? Because I'm going out Monday and Tuesday, and I guarantee it will rain. It's rained on me every week since May. So those will be the wet days. I should go down to Yankton. I seem to carry rain with me. But with that, I will close. Thank you very much for participating today. Tony will send out a notice as to what next month's discussion will be, but I certainly appreciate your attendance for today. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks again for participating.